The last light of the day bled out across the prairie in a pale wash of violet and ash. Wind pressed through the dry grass, carrying the bitter scent of dust and smoke. Beneath a weather-twisted cottonwood, a woman hung half-slumped against the coarse bark, her wrists bound with rawhide, her breath shallow. The rope that had failed to take her life left a red, burning circle around her neck. She was not yet 30, though grief had carved its lines across her face. Her name was Eliza, though no one in her family had spoken it kindly in years. They had called her barren, cursed, a waste of food and dowry. And so they had judged her, their own blood, fit for the tree. She stirred faintly as a horse's hoofbeats drew near. The sound came steady, unhurried, as though the rider had already seen the world's cruelty and found little left to startle him. Jonas Hale reined in his sorrel gelding, a scar-faced man with a frame worn by the saddle and years of cattle drives. His eyes, pale and unreadable, fixed on the sight of the woman barely clinging to life. For a long moment he did nothing, as though weighing whether she was real or some cruel trick cast by the failing light. Then he swung down, boots sinking into the dust, and pulled the knife from his belt. The rawhide gave way beneath a practiced hand. Eliza's body crumpled, the air shuddering out of her chest in a broken gasp. Jonas caught her before she struck the ground, his arms strong but careful. He said nothing, only shifted her weight across his shoulder, the rope burns raw beneath her chin. Her eyes fluttered open long enough to glimpse the scar that ran along his jaw, a mark of some old violence. Then she fell back into the dark. The gelding bore them both as night gathered its shadows. Jonas rode without haste, without comfort, his silence a wall between them and the questions he did not ask. The town lights flickered faint in the distance when at last he guided the horse down its rutted main street. Faces turned as they passed. Lanterns swayed on porches, revealing townsfolk in their evening routines, men with cards half played, women with wash still in their hands. Their eyes fixed on the woman draped in Jonas's arms, and whispers ran quick as prairie fire. "That's her," someone muttered. "The barren one. Her own kin tried to do it. Best leave her be, Hale, or she'll bring you nothing but curse." Jonas did not answer. His gaze stayed forward, his jaw set, the brim of his hat shadowing his scar. His presence alone, the cut of his shoulders and the long rifle at his saddle, kept the murmurs at a distance. He asked no shelter, knocked at no door. He did not beg kindness from people who had none to spare. Instead, he turned his horse away from the lamps and laughter, toward the black outline of the hills. The trail carried them to the edge of the settlement where the land rose in quiet folds. A single cabin stood against the horizon, its chimney breathing a thin coil of smoke. Jonas dismounted, lifting Eliza as though she weighed no more than a child. The cabin door groaned open, and warmth met them, firelight trembling over rough-hewn beams, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. He laid her gently on a narrow bed against the wall, covering her with a wool blanket. His eyes moved to the rope burns around her throat, the bruises on her wrists, but he asked no questions. He poured water into a tin cup, setting it on the table beside her, then crossed to the hearth to feed another stick of wood into the flames. Eliza stirred, her voice raw and broken. Why would you bring me here?" Jonas glanced over his shoulder, the firelight drawing sharp edges across his scar. "You were still breathing," he said simply. His voice was low, rough with years of silence. "Nothing more." She tried to swallow but winced at the pain in her throat. The weight of the blanket pressed comfort against her trembling, yet shame rose with it. He had seen her helpless, discarded like a carcass. The world had judged her barren, unworthy even of life. She felt less than human. Jonas returned to the hearth, poured himself coffee from the pot, and sat in the chair that rocked slightly with his weight. He drank without looking at her, his silence unbroken except for the slow creak of wood. To her, it was not cruelty. It was something stranger, a refusal to demand explanation, to demand proof of her worth. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls, carrying the faint sound of coyotes. Inside, the fire crackled, steady and sure. Eliza closed her eyes, the warmth drawing her toward sleep. Her last thought before darkness claimed her was not of her parents' faces twisted in judgment, but of the scarred man who had cut her down and carried her without a word. For the first time since the rope had tightened at her throat, she felt the faint thread of survival. Dignity, though beaten low, might yet be possible if even one man stood by her, not with words but with the simple act of refusing to leave her behind. Morning came muted, as though the world itself wished to tread lightly over broken things. Eliza woke beneath the wool blanket, her throat raw, the rope burned stiff and aching. She shifted slowly, the sound of an axe striking wood outside echoing through the thin cabin walls. Each blow carried rhythm, a steady cadence of work that needed no witness. Her hand moved to her neck, fingers tracing the ridged circle left there. The skin throbbed beneath her touch, but the greater ache rose from memory. She saw her father's hand again, rough and merciless, tightening the rope while his eyes blazed with shame disguised as righteousness. She remembered her mother's face, pale and lowered, lips pressed tight against the plea she would not speak. Not even one word of defense. It was not murder they attempted, her kin would have said, but correction, as though infertility were sin enough to erase her right to breathe. The door creaked open. Jonas stepped in, the cold on his coat steaming faintly as he set down an armload of split logs. His eyes flickered toward her, only long enough to see that she was awake, then shifted back to the hearth. He stacked the wood beside it and set about stirring the embers. No question crossed his lips. No demand for her history, no judgment laid upon her. His silence pressed against the room, but unlike her family's, it was not cruel. It was simply his way. He poured water into a blackened pot, set it over the flame, and soon the sharp scent of coffee filled the cabin. Eliza drew the blanket tighter, watching him move with quiet efficiency. Every motion bore the weight of repetition, as if the tasks were the scaffolding of his life. "Drink," he said when the coffee was ready, handing her a tin cup. His scarred hand lingered only long enough to ensure she could hold it steady. She sipped, the heat burning her tongue but grounding her in the present. For days, their lives found rhythm. Jonas split wood, mended tack, tended the horses in the lean-to. Eliza moved slowly at first, her strength returning in small increments. She swept the hearth, folded the few blankets, stitched a tear in his shirt. She felt the need to repay him, though he had never asked. Still, the silence stretched long between them, heavy but not hollow. At night, when the fire's glow softened the shadows, her eyes wandered to the tokens of another life scattered about the cabin. The rocking chair that creaked faintly when Jonas sat in it, its back draped with a woman's shawl, worn soft at the edges. A cedar chest at the foot of the bed, its lid closed but not locked, a corner of fabric peeking out, ivory, fragile, unmistakably a wedding dress. On a shelf, an unfinished toy horse carved of pine, its legs uneven, sanded smooth but left without detail. These objects told their own story, though Jonas never spoke of them. She understood enough, he too carried absence. A wife perhaps, or a bride who never stood before him. A child that never learned to play with the toy horse. His cabin was filled with ghosts as hers had been filled with accusations. At times she thought to ask, to break the silence with words that acknowledged his pain as well as hers. Yet when she looked at him, bent over his work or staring into the flames with eyes distant and unreadable, she found herself unable. The silence felt like a pact neither had spoken, yet both honored. But her memories pressed upon her, unwelcome. When she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face twisted with rage, heard the scrape of rope against bark. She would wake with her breath caught, fingers clawing at her neck. Each time, Jonas's head would lift, his pale eyes settling on her from across the room. He never asked. He never intruded. But he kept the fire stoked so the dark never swallowed her whole. One evening, when the wind outside moaned like a wounded animal and snow scratched at the windows, she found her voice. "They said I was no woman at all," she whispered, not certain he would even hear. Jonas looked up from his chair, the shadow of the fire cutting deep into the scar along his jaw. His gaze held her, steady, neither pitying nor dismissive. "Folks say many things," he answered after a long moment, his tone flat but not unkind. Then he returned his eyes to the flames, as if to let her decide whether that was the end or only the beginning. The words were few, but they lingered longer than a sermon. She realized then that he had no need for her confessions, no need to pry open wounds. He carried his own, and perhaps understood better than anyone that some scars did not need constant prodding. In his silence, she began to feel less alone. The shame she had borne like a brand did not vanish, but its fire dimmed in the presence of someone who asked nothing of her except to exist. She had thought herself singular in grief, a castaway beyond compassion. Yet in Jonas's cabin, beneath his quiet watch, she saw that pain had carved them both into shapes that still fit within the same room. That night, when the wind finally hushed and the snow lay heavy across the land, Eliza lay awake, staring at the fire's last embers. She thought of the shawl, the dress, the toy horse. She thought of the way Jonas's eyes softened, just slightly, when they met hers in the glow. And for the first time since her family left her for dead, she understood that grief recognized in another was not only a burden. It could be a bond, fragile and wordless, but real. Neither of them was alone in their shadows. The morning broke gray, the sky already heavy with clouds rolling low across the horizon. The air carried that thick, metallic scent that warned of rain to come, the kind that could turn trails to rivers and leave the land drowned in silence. Jonas pulled on his coat and hat, his rifle slung across his shoulder, preparing his gelding for the ride to town. The supplies were running thin, and storms cared little for those unprepared. Eliza watched him from the cabin doorway, shawl drawn around her shoulders. "It looks bad out there," she murmured. "Worse if we run out of flour and beans," he answered simply, adjusting the saddle cinch. His words were steady, but his eyes flickered to the clouds with the caution of a man who had learned to read weather as well as men's faces. He met her gaze only briefly. "Bar the door behind me. Keep the fire high." She nodded, though her stomach knotted at the thought of being left alone. When the gelding carried him down the trail, she shut the door and slid the wooden bar across, the cabin suddenly larger and emptier without his presence. By noon, the first drops of rain spattered the roof, soft at first, then harder, until the storm roared around her. Eliza tended the fire, her thoughts circling like restless hawks. She told herself she was safe here, wrapped in wool and silence, yet unease crept into her bones. The knock came sudden, harsh, against the door. She froze. Then voices followed, slurred and taunting, carried by the storm. "Open up, girl. We know you're in there." Her breath hitched. She recognized one voice, sharp and cruel, belonging to her cousin Matthew, the same man who had tightened the rope at her throat weeks ago. Another voice chimed in, rough with whiskey. "No use hiding. Ain't no place for a barren woman on this land. Best Hale knows it too." Eliza's knees weakened. She backed away from the door, hands trembling. They hammered again, the wood shuddering under their fists. Her eyes darted to the rifle propped in the corner. She had barely touched it before, her hands unsure, but now instinct drove her. She snatched it up, the weight heavy, unfamiliar. She pressed herself against the wall near the hearth, breath shallow. The storm rattled the shutters, thunder cracking like gunfire overhead. The men shouted again. "Jonas don't need the likes of you. Best he send you out before we do it for him." Their laughter rose, ugly and merciless. Eliza's heart pounded. Images surged back, her father's fury, her mother's downcast silence, the rope digging into her skin. She gripped the rifle tighter, though her hands shook so fiercely the barrel trembled. Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them away, forcing herself to steady her breath. The latch rattled. She stifled a cry, raising the rifle toward the door though she prayed they would never force it open. For a moment the cabin seemed to shrink, its walls closing in with the weight of their jeers and the roar of rain. Then another sound broke through, hooves pounding hard against mud. A new knock, firm and deliberate, silenced the voices outside. Eliza's breath caught. The door creaked open, and there stood Jonas, rain pouring off the brim of his hat, coat soaked through, eyes like steel in the lantern glow. The men fell back a step, but they did not leave. One sneered, spitting into the mud. "She don't belong here, Hale. You do better turning her out before her curse takes root in your house." Jonas stepped inside, water dripping from his coat to the floorboards. He didn't reach for his rifle, didn't bark words or threats. He simply stood there, scarred jaw set, his hand resting easy, but unmistakably, on the holster at his side. His eyes, cold as the storm, fixed on each man in turn. The silence stretched, broken only by the howl of wind. Eliza, still clutching the rifle, felt her breath slow. She saw the way his presence filled the room, not loud, not brash, but heavy with certainty. The men shifted uneasily. Their bravado faltered beneath his gaze. One muttered something under his breath, another kicked at the mud, but none stepped forward. Jonas did not move, did not speak, but his stillness was louder than any shout. At last, Matthew spat again and jerked his head toward the trail. "Ain't worth it," he muttered. "Let the scarred bastard keep his cursed woman." Their footsteps sloshed away into the storm, swallowed by the rain. Jonas closed the door, slid the bar into place, and crossed to the window. He checked the shutters, then moved to the other side of the room, hammering boards across weak places where the wind pushed through. His motions were calm, steady, as if boarding up against storms and men alike was the same work. Eliza lowered the rifle, her arms trembling with the effort of holding it. Her knees threatened to give. Jonas turned, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. He said nothing. He lit a lantern, set it on the table, and poured coffee from the pot still sitting on the hearth. The steam rose between them, carrying the bitter comfort of something steady, something normal. He slid the tin cup toward her. She took it with both hands, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. The storm still raged outside, rattling the walls, but inside, the silence was different now. It was not emptiness. It was protection, carried in the shape of a man willing to stand between cruelty and the abandoned without ever raising his voice. Eliza sipped the coffee, her hand steadier than before. She realized, as the lantern light flickered against the scar on his jaw, that dignity did not always arrive in grand rescues or tender words. Sometimes it came in the shape of a scarred man who risked his standing in a town that whispered, simply by choosing not to turn away. Snow fell in steady silence, the world beyond the cabin swallowed by white. Days blurred into one another, the trails impassable, the town cut off. The cabin became their whole world, the walls close, the air thick with wood smoke and unspoken words. Eliza rose each morning to the sound of Jonas splitting kindling outside, the steady rhythm marking time in a life otherwise suspended. She tried to give herself purpose, sweeping the hearth, mending his shirts with thread frayed but serviceable, stacking wood by the stove before the cold could seep in too deep. She moved quietly, unsure if she was imposing, yet determined to repay his protection with dignity where she could. At times, shame crept into her chest like the draft beneath the door. Gratitude pressed heavy on her shoulders, tangled with something harder to name. Was she only surviving here, or was she beginning to need him? Dependence frightened her almost as much as abandonment had. Jonas said little, but she caught the way his eyes lingered when she thought he wasn't looking. Not with hunger, not with pity, but with something closer to recognition. He saw her small strengths, the way she still braided her hair each morning though the scar at her throat made the motion painful, the way she placed her hand gently on the cedar chest when dusting, her touch reverent as though she knew what ghosts lived inside it. Their words, when they came, were plain. Talk of the weather, of how the cattle would fare in the snow, of whether the roof might hold if the storm deepened. Yet each exchange carried weight, as though both sensed more lay beneath the surface but neither dared reach for it. One evening, the storm outside pressed hard against the windows, and Jonas sat carving by the fire. His hands, scarred and strong, worked a piece of pine into the rough shape of another toy horse. Eliza watched from her place at the hearth, mending a shirt whose elbows had long ago given way. The silence between them was thick but not empty. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft. "You keep your hands busy, even when there's no call for it." He looked up briefly, then back to the carving. "Work steadies a man," he said. "Keeps his thoughts from running wild." Eliza folded the mended shirt across her lap. "And when they do run wild?" Jonas's knife paused against the wood. The fire cracked. Then he resumed carving. "Then you best hope no one's around to hear them." The words might have ended there, but something in his tone told her he carried his own thoughts like unbroken horses, dangerous if loosed. She said nothing more, yet the moment lingered between them, fragile and unspoken. As the days wore on, their silences changed. They were no longer voids filled with suspicion or fear, but spaces where breath slowed, where the sound of wood snapping in the fire or snow sliding off the roof seemed to speak enough. Once, when she stumbled while carrying a log, Jonas was at her side before she could steady herself. His hand closed around her arm, firm but careful, his eyes searching her face as though to be certain she wasn't hurt. The touch was brief, but it burned in her memory long after he stepped away. That night, lying awake beneath the wool blanket, she wondered at the strange comfort of it, how a single hand against her arm could feel like more protection than any words her family had ever spoken. Jonas, too, seemed altered. His steps grew less guarded in the cabin, his presence less distant. He left his carving tools on the table instead of packing them away, as though willing to let her see his unfinished work. He accepted the mended shirts without protest, his nod carrying more gratitude than his words ever would. One morning, as she swept the hearth, she asked quietly, "Do you ever think of leaving this place behind? Of starting new somewhere far?" Jonas, bent over his boots by the door, tied the laces slowly before answering. "A man can ride 100 miles, but he carries the same ghosts with him. Distance don't bury them." She stilled, the broom in her hands. He did not look at her, but she felt the truth of his words settle between them. The snow thickened that afternoon, blotting out the world entirely. The cabin seemed to breathe with them, its walls holding in the heat, its corners alive with shadows. Eliza sat near the fire, braiding her hair. Jonas watched her for a long moment, the knife still in his hand. His eyes rested not on the scar at her throat, but on the braid itself, neat and deliberate, a small act of defiance against ruin. The air carried a charge that was not from the storm outside. It was something quieter, heavier, drawn from the simple fact of two souls forced together by fate and weather, each learning the contours of the other's silence. Eliza realized then that silence was no longer the language of loneliness. It had become the ground on which trust could take its first fragile steps. The ache of restraint remained, the space between them thick with what neither would name, but beneath it pulsed something alive. When she banked the fire for the night, she looked once toward Jonas in his chair, the unfinished horse resting on his knee. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, and though neither spoke, the moment felt like the beginning of something that could carry them through more than snow. In the hush of that long storm-bound night, Eliza understood that silence could be both wound and balm. And here, in this cabin, it had begun to turn into something closer to trust. The night was deep and brittle with cold, the kind where even the stars seemed sharpened to knives. Eliza stirred awake to a sound that did not belong to wind or snow, a low, guttural howl rolling across the frozen dark. She sat up, heart thrumming, and heard the answering cries, closer this time. The horses in the corral screamed and thrashed, hooves hammering against the frozen ground. Jonas was already at the door, pulling on his coat with a swiftness born of instinct. His rifle rested in his hand like an extension of his arm. "Stay inside," he said without looking back. But Eliza's blood surged, her body moving before thought could catch her. She snatched the lantern from the hook, lifting it high. The wolves' cries split the night again, cruel and hungry. "You can't fight them alone," she whispered, though he was already stepping into the storm. She followed. The snow bit at her face as they stumbled into the yard. The corral shook with the frenzy of panicked horses, their eyes rolling white. Beyond the fence, dark shapes slipped through the drifts, wolves, lean and desperate, their bodies shadows until the firelight caught their eyes. Jonas raised his rifle and fired. The crack split the night, echoing through the valley. One wolf fell back, yelping, while others slunk closer, teeth bared. Eliza held the lantern high, its glow cutting ragged circles into the snow. She wanted to flee, to hide, but instead she found herself gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles ached. Jonas fired again, and another wolf scattered. Yet the pack was not easily deterred. One lunged toward the fence, snarling. Without thinking, Eliza rushed forward, swinging the lantern. Flames streaked through the air, and the creature skidded back into the shadows, its growl fading. For long minutes, the night roared with rifle cracks and the frenzied pounding of hooves. Eliza's breath came in sharp bursts, the lantern shaking in her hands, but she did not falter. She stood at Jonas's side, fear swallowed by a fiercer resolve. Together, they drove the wolves into retreat, until at last the cries thinned, fading into the storm. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the panting of horses and the crunch of Jonas's boots as he leaned against the fence. His shoulders sagged, his breath uneven. "Jonas?" Eliza stepped closer, the lantern's flame trembling over his face. His scar looked harsher in the firelight, but his eyes were unfocused, glazed with exhaustion. "It's nothing," he muttered, but when he shifted, pain twisted his features. She saw then the dark stain seeping at his side, not from tonight but from some older wound that the struggle had reopened. His strength, so unyielding, now bent like a branch under too much snow. Eliza dropped the lantern into the snowbank and caught his arm before he could fall. "Lean on me," she ordered, her voice firmer than she expected. He obeyed, his weight heavy but not crushing, his silence more trusting than words could have been. Inside the cabin, she eased him into the rocking chair by the fire. His face was pale beneath the shadow of his hat. She pulled it away, setting it aside, then stripped off his coat and shirt, her hands trembling yet steady where it mattered. The wound was shallow but angry, reopened along an old scar. She cleaned it with water, her fingers brushing against the ridges of his past pain. Jonas did not flinch, only watched her with those pale, unreadable eyes. The fire cast gold across his features, softening the hard lines, making him look almost younger. Her voice broke the silence, low and raw. "I thought I was worth nothing." She dabbed at the wound, her breath uneven. "They told me so, again and again, until I almost believed dying was easier than staying." Her hands lingered on the cloth, pressing gently against his side. "But you carried me. You said nothing, but you stayed. And somehow, in your silence, I found a piece of myself I thought was gone." The fire snapped, sparks leaping. Jonas's gaze did not waver. He breathed slow, the rise and fall of his chest brushing against her hand where it lingered. At last, he spoke, his voice low and graveled. "Silence has been my prison." His eyes dropped briefly, as though ashamed of the confession. "Too many words buried with the dead. Too many things I never said when there was still time." He looked back to her, the scar along his jaw catching the light. "But since you've been here, it's felt less empty." Eliza's throat tightened, not with fear this time but with something close to relief. She let out a shaky breath, her hand still resting over his wound. The fire burned steadily, its warmth wrapping around them both. There was no kiss, no sudden embrace, only the quiet settling of two people who had been battered by solitude, now finding the faint glow of companionship. Their bond burned like embers, steady and alive, not wild flames but something that could last. Jonas leaned back, exhaustion overtaking him, but his eyes remained on her until they closed. Eliza pulled the blanket from the bed and draped it over him, her hand lingering for a moment on his shoulder. She sat by the fire long after, watching the embers fade to red. Her heart was still thundering from the wolves, from the fear, from the confession that had slipped from her lips. Yet beneath it all, she felt something new, not the desperate clamor of survival, but the quieter certainty that she was not alone, and never had been since he cut her down from that tree. The storm raged outside, wind howling across the frozen land. But inside, beneath the roof of Jonas Hale's cabin, a different kind of fire had taken root. The thaw came slowly, the snow melting into deep furrows of mud that clung to boots and hooves alike. Winter's grip loosened, but the air carried another weight, heavy with the knowledge that silence could not hold forever. Eliza felt it first, the unease that lingered when the wind shifted and she thought she heard voices in the distance. Jonas sensed it too. His hand rested more often on the rifle, his gaze scanning the horizon when he led the gelding to water. Something was coming, and both knew it. It was a morning sharp with frost when they appeared, riders cresting the ridge, their silhouettes jagged against the pale sun. 5 men, her kin among them, faces she knew too well. Her father, his posture still rigid with self-righteous anger. Her cousin Matthew, who had spat curses into the storm. Others from their clan, their eyes hard and narrow, as if convinced justice was theirs to claim. Eliza's breath caught, but she did not retreat. She stood in the yard, shawl drawn around her shoulders, her scar plain in the light of day. Jonas came from the barn, his rifle in hand, his eyes settling on the riders with the steadiness of stone. He did not step in front of her this time. Instead, he stood just at her side, close enough that she felt his presence like a wall of strength, yet far enough to leave the choice hers. The men reined in hard, mud splattering. Her father's voice broke the silence, rough as gravel. "You were meant to hang, girl. What curse binds you here now? Or has this drifter bewitched you, filled your head with devilry?" The old shame threatened to rise, clawing at her throat. But Eliza drew the shawl tighter, grounding herself in its warmth, in the weight of Jonas's silent watch. She stepped forward, trembling but upright. "I was meant to die," she said, her voice unsteady but clear, "because I could not bear you sons." The words seemed to freeze in the air, heavy with the cruelty they carried. "But I did not die. And I will not live by your judgment any longer." Matthew spat into the mud. "You think this scarred cattle hand gives you honor? He'll cast you off soon enough, same as we did." Jonas shifted, his hand resting easy on the rifle. His silence was louder than any threat. But Eliza raised her voice again before he could speak. "You cast me off because I could not be your vessel. But I have learned there is worth in breath, in labor, in tending fire and earth. Worth in being more than the sum of what you demand. I belong to no one's judgment. Not yours. Not any man's." The men stirred uneasily. Townsfolk had begun to gather on the ridge, drawn by the sight of confrontation. Eyes peered from behind fences, from doorways half closed. Whispers carried. Her father's face hardened. "You shame our bloodline." Eliza lifted her chin, the scar raw but unhidden. "No. You shamed yourselves when you tried to bury a daughter for not birthing sons." The word struck sharper than any rifle shot. Silence fell over the yard, heavy as snowfall. Even the horses shifted nervously. Jonas's hand never left his rifle, but his eyes lingered on her, steady and proud in their quiet way. For the first time, Eliza realized he did not need to speak for her, nor fight in her place. His role was not savior but witness, standing with her so she could claim her own voice. Her family shifted in their saddles, shame gnawing at the edges of their anger. One by one, their gazes dropped. Matthew muttered something under his breath. Her father's jaw clenched, but when he yanked his reins and wheeled his horse, the others followed. Their retreat was slow, bitter, but it was retreat nonetheless. The townsfolk did not cheer. They did not jeer either. They simply watched as Eliza stood in the mud, shawl wrapped close, her chest rising and falling with the effort of what she had done. For the first time since the rope had burned her neck, she felt her dignity returned, not as something granted, but as something claimed. Jonas stepped toward her, leading his gelding by the reins. He held them out to her, a gesture plain yet heavy with meaning. She looked at him, at the scar that spoke of his own reckonings, at the silence that had been both shield and prison. Slowly, she took the reins. He mounted first, steady and sure, then extended his hand. She accepted, her fingers curling into his rough palm. He pulled her up beside him, not behind him, not as burden or property, but as equal. They rode through town together, the eyes of neighbors upon them. The whispers no longer cut her. The silence of the ride was not empty but full, filled with choice and companionship, with the quiet vow of two souls bound not by blood or law, but by the simple refusal to let one another be abandoned. The trail stretched ahead, rutted with thaw and shadowed by the last drifts of winter. Behind them, the echoes of judgment faded. Before them lay only the road home. Jonas did not speak, and neither did Eliza. Yet the silence carried all that needed saying. It was a silence no longer of loneliness, but of two lives that had weathered storm, shadow, and fire, and now moved forward side by side. And in that silence, she found more than survival. She found dignity. She found a bond that burned steady, like embers against the cold, a vow without words. The gelding carried them back to the cabin, to the rocking chair, to the fire, to whatever came next. The sky overhead was pale and wide, the storm gone. And for the first time, Eliza felt the vastness of it not as emptiness, but as promise.